most of us are aware, perhaps painfully aware, that sacred literature in many faiths contains problematic passages that can encourage hatred, encourage chauvinism, encourage war. And Judaism is no different in this respect. But of course what we're seeing today is a conscious effort on the part of many people around the world, people of many faiths, to try to not simply toss the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, if there are problematical passages in this work, let's just get rid of it or totally ignore it, but rather to reinterpret these passages, to try to build a different understanding and a more positive understanding. And that is what Rabbi Lewis has attempted to do in his book. I have my copy, which I just bought. There are other copies up here for those of you who might want to purchase one. Or let me mention that this evening there's going to be another event, this one at Beit Am on 36th Street from 7 to about 8:30 or 9. And there will be copies of Rabbi Lewis's book there as well. But let me go on and introduce the Rabbi, Sheldon Lewis, known as Shelly. He is from Chicago, attended the university there, moved on to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, and to study under the legendary, revered Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, really one of the last group to go through studying under Rabbi Heschel, who passed away in 1972. Heschel, so noted for his importance as a philosopher and as a theologian, but also very, very much as an activist, notable for his work, for example, in the civil rights movement, close associate of Martin Luther King, etc., 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 and many of his students and young rabbis, including Rabbi Lewis, had to find this message, this implicit message in his work, inspirational. In any case, Rabbi Lewis, after his ordination, went on and served as an army chaplain in Vietnam in 1971-72. He then returned to the United States where for more than 30 years he served as a rabbi to a congregation in Palo Alto, California, where he remains Rabbi Emeritus. He has continued his work in terms of human rights issues, peace issues. Rabbis for Human Rights is an organization he's an active member of, various groups that seek peace and reconciliation in the Middle East. In 2001, he published the Torah of Reconciliation, a study of passages in the Torah or Pentateuch, as well as in other Jewish sacred texts, which he will be addressing in a few minutes. This work was a personal response of his to the events of 9/11, and as a matter of fact, he started to compile it on 9/12, the day after the bombings of the World Trade Center, as he sought, quote, a way of acting in the world beyond anger and violence. And with this, I am very proud to be able to introduce Rabbi Lewis. Sheldon.
Thank you so much. I just keep that one copy.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Didn't mean it all.
I don't have it committed to memory. Well, thank you, Professor Kupperman, and to my dear friends, Becky Charbonneau and Kent Blumenthal, and for inviting me. This is my first time in Corvallis, my first time at OSU, and I feel very much welcomed, and I appreciate your coming out on a rainy day, late afternoon, to hear a little bit about what is really the passion for me, the passion of my life, the process of pathways to reconciliation. You mentioned Professor Heschel, who was very formative for me. I was a pretty shy graduate student at the seminary, but I just followed him around and I studied wherever he was teaching, and I just took him in. And I just wanted to tell you one story that illustrates that. One day, I was privileged to be having lunch with him and a couple of other fellow students in the seminary dining room, and he had a speaking engagement. It was very well, it might have had to do with his partnership with Martin Luther King, or one of the other many causes with which he was engaged. He had those of you that know his face, he had a really, we call Hadrat Panim. He was really a very striking, charismatic figure, but he didn't have a full beard. He had a little space between his sideburns and his beard, so he shaved. He used to use an electric razor, but there wasn't time after lunch to go back to his home to shave. And I said, Professor Heschel, my room was a floor up above the dining room. I'll get you mine in. And so I ran up and got mine. We went to his office. He shaved, handed me the razor, and off he went to the lecture. And there I was with my shaver, and the whiskers of my Rebbe. And those of you that know a little bit about Hasidic life and followers of a Rebbe, this wouldn't sound too strange about having, in some sense, a little relic. And I wish I could say that to this day I have this razor. I wouldn't use it, and that was the beginning of his beard. It wasn't. But it just shows how the influence he had on me. It was profound. As was my experience, my loneliest and most painful year as a U.S. Army chaplain in Vietnam, and my experience with the deep tragedies of war, especially a war which was so much morally questionable as the enterprise in Vietnam. So many experiences, but I really wanted to get quickly to the subject at hand. When it came to 9/11, I think it was really this passion. It was brewing within me for probably all of my adult life. But 9/11 came. Among the other things that shook me was this very egregious expression of how zealous religious devotees can do something so evil, coming from their devotion, their religious devotion, from my perspective, from the distorted way in which they pursued it. And I know there's, of course, and you know too, there's a long history of really terrible things happened which have occurred in the name of all major faiths, including Jewish faith. But I knew too, and really I devoted my life to Jewish life and the rabbinate because of my conviction that the good that could come out of a religious tradition far outweighs the possible evil. But I wanted to search for it. I wanted to show it. I didn't know that it was going to be a book. I wanted to find it for myself, for consolation, and maybe to teach in my community in a smaller radius. But step by step, it became something more. And for the next 11 years, I worked on it, and I had the privilege of finally put it together. Incidentally, I'm so happy to be on this trip with my wife, Lori, too. And I went just to show you that when you look at the cover of my book, there are two hands, and one of them is my wife's hand. The others is my own, and we can verify that after the lecture if you want. Which goes to prove that in many ways she does have a hand in this book. So I started this search through this immense literature, the product of millennia, of scholars and sages and thinkers who contributed, who since the time of Torah, ever since and ongoing to this moment, levels and levels of commentary, hundreds. Who knows? Who can count hundreds of thousands of volumes? Not that I looked at all of them, but searching for the resources for compassion and reconciliation. I knew they were there. I wasn't a novice. It's that I love to study sacred texts, and it still is at the center of my life. But I didn't know how rich it was until I really made a decision to be disciplined and to look. And what I found was this incredible treasury, much richer than I was stunned by it, really stunned by it. Now I know, and you know, that there are the opposite messages in Jewish tradition. If there's a Torah reconciliation, there's also a Torah, a militant Torah, a chauvinist Torah, a cruel Torah, an insular Torah. There is, and other people have written those books. They're the opposite of mine, and there are people to this moment who live by those values too. But my assertion is to give you the end conclusion at the beginning is, and to adapt a wonderful saying of Martin Luther King, that the arc of Torah bends slowly but inexorably towards compassion and reconciliation, much more than any other direction. The Rebbe said there are shivim panim laTorah. There are 70 faces of Torah, which means it's a proverbial way of saying there's an unlimited number of faces to Torah, but one wants to find something else there. This is, in my mind, the most basic. We, as the recipients of a sacred tradition, if we find texts that are objectionable, there are limited things we can do with them. We can't rip them out and dispose of them. I guess if I were a Unitarian, I could, but I'm not. And so I have to somehow live with uncomfortable texts and deal with them in some way. Live with them. In the synagogue, in the course of a year, those who are familiar with a traditional synagogue, the readings cover every verse, every letter in Torah every year in the cycle of readings, and nothing is left out, and everything is read with the same devotion and the same concern for accuracy, pronouncing correctly, the same trope, the same the right punctuation, and so forth. But some of them, there's a backstory to the ones that are difficult, and we deal with them in different ways. And what I want to show you today in the next period of time that we have is to show you an example of one of the things that I love, and that is how some of these texts have been lifted up and utterly transformed by the agency of interpretation, and have been made different. For me, when I come across them now, I see them through the lens of this or that commentary from 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or yesterday, but someone who's lifted up these texts and made them even inspiring, despite their questionable origins. So that's my goal, and to show you a few examples. They're all in the book, and more, but I want to just give you a sample of them. You'll remember, it was those of you that followed the cycle of readings, just last week's reading in the book of Genesis, we read about Jacob and Isaac, and Jacob's, you remember the story of how he, complicit with his mother, disguised as his brother, essentially fooled his father into giving him the blessing of the firstborn, really the low point in Jacob's life. And that verse, at the center of that verse, are these words that the father, Isaac, who's blind at this time and really can't see very well, but he can hear and he can feel, and he feels his son and he hears his voice, and he says, "Hakol kol Yitzchak, Yaakov, Hayadayim Yedei Esav." The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Now the pshat of that verse, that simple meaning is clear. He's confused by this, although ultimately he accepts the fact that it must be Esau, and he does give the greeting under these false pretenses to his son Jacob. And there's a rabbinic commentary on just those words, which I'd like to share with you. It comes from Midrash Rabbah, this wonderful commentary, collection of commentaries on the books of the Torah and Genesis. And this is what's said. The voice is the voice of Jacob, quoting the words from the reading, the Torah reading. Rabbi Brechia said, "When Jacob lowers his voice, the hands of Esau rule. As it is written, all of the community complained about Moses. And Amalek came. And when he chirps with his voice, when he chirps with his voice, the hands of Esau are denied. The hands of Esau do not have dominion." Rabbi Abba, the son of Kahana, said, "Never arose such great philosophers in the world as Bilam the son of Beor and Abnomos of Gedera. All the heathens assembled before Abnomos and asked him, 'Do you think that we can subjugate this people, the Jewish people?' 'Go around to their synagogues and schools,' he replied, 'and if you find there children chirping with their voices, that is, while learning Torah or in prayer, you can subjugate this people. You cannot subjugate this people. For thus their father promised them when he said to them, the voice is the voice of Jacob. When the voice of Jacob rings out in the synagogues, Esau has no hands. And if not, the hands are the hands of Esau." Now, I know this is a little bit confusing just to listen to these words, so let me just, with your permission, I'd like to just read my comment where I try to elucidate what's happening in this midrash. The Hebrew word for voice, repeated twice in this Torah verse, is kol. In the first instance, it is written in a deficient form without the letter vav. It's missing one letter. In that form, the word lends itself to a very different understanding. It can be read as a verb, meaning to lower or to diminish. And thus the verse could be understood in this novel way. If Jacob diminishes his voice, then the hands of Esav, are dominant. The voice of prayer, learning, or simple communication is now measured against the hands, a symbol of power or violence. When the softer instruments of intellect and spirit are vital, then violence is held in check. Jacob's reaction is seen in the Midrash as a reflection on two sources of strength. The strength of the Jewish people is measured by the extent to which they are devoted to the sacred use of their voices, such as in learning and speaking words of Torah. The expression chirping, l'tzavtzev, in the rabbinic passage refers to the sound of young people learning and discussing a sacred text aloud in the house of study. In times of conflict, words become sacred tools for bridging gaps. As long as channels of communication are open, there is hope for understanding the other better, for correcting misapprehension, for expressing even passionately one's perspective, and finally for discovering a solution without violence. So what he's doing here, if I can jump to a conclusion, because of one missing vav, one letter that's missing in the text, and it's handed down by tradition to be read in this deficient form, missing vav. This whole new structure of interpretation is built upon that missing vav. Now you can read it as a verb, lahakel. If Jacob lowers his voice, im hekel kol Yaakov, if he lowers his voice, then yadayim yidei esav, then the hands, which are symbolic of misuse of hands, really a violent use of hands with weapons and so forth, then the hands predominate. But the opposite is true. If they are strengthened, if the voice of Jacob is strengthened by prayer, by study, really by compassionate communication with other human beings, then the hands are much less likely to prevail. It becomes a study about two ways of operating in the world, two ways of engaging in the world. I cannot read these verses anymore without reading this midrash as part of it. And so for me, that passage helps to redeem, an ancient passage. It doesn't change it. It doesn't change the literal meaning, but the gloss on it, centuries, maybe even a millennium after they were first penned and reached their final form in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, a gloss can change what they mean. So that's one example for you. Incidentally, I'd love this to be interactive. So if I say something that's confusing, or if you have a question, don't wait till the end. I know the time's going to elapse sooner than I would like. We're going to jump to the end of the book of Genesis, actually, for another last episode in the life of Jacob. Now he's a grown man. Now it's near the end of his life. And remember, he's brought forth 12 tribes, and actually 12 sons and one daughter, too. We don't hear about Dinah very much, but there was one daughter. And he brings his sons before him, and he gives them a blessing. It's not really a blessing. It's really a prophecy. He's addressing who they are and what their future destiny might be. And at one point, this is at the end in Parshat Vayikhi, at the end of the book of Genesis, he's talking about Judah, the tribe of Judah. This is what he says about Judah. I'm just going to read there's 5 verses, but I just want you to have a flavor of a couple of them. Judah, your brethren shall praise you, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion and as a lioness. Who shall rouse him up? So the images is this passage, and the other 3 verses as well contribute to this. It's a triumphal set of verses. It's an aggressive future for Judah. He's going to standing on the neck of his enemies. They will bow down. He's compared to a lion or a lioness. If he's roused, he's formidable. Judah, you'll remember, it was a third of the sons born to Jacob. We know about him through various passages earlier in his life. But he wouldn't have emerged as so prominent, except in Jewish history later. The tribe of Judah becomes the preeminent tribe because the 10 tribes in the north, those that remember, are lost, and essentially Judah and Benjamin, but Judah becomes the preeminent tribe, and it gives its name to the Jewish people, and to the word Jew. Jew comes from Judah too. So it looms larger because this is a prophecy about the destiny of the Jewish people. Now, Rabbeinu, to me this is a difficult verse. If this is talking about my destiny and the destiny of the Jewish people, it's a triumphal verse, an aggressive verse about triumphing over Israel's enemies. And there have been many, as you know, but I have great difficulty with it. But Rabbeinu Bachya, a great commentator in the 14th century. Now, I hope I'm not jerking you around too much from one millennium to the next. I hope you don't mind. We're in a time warp here. But Rabbeinu Bachya, this is what he says. 14th century. If you look at this passage, you will find in the blessing of Judah all the letters of the Aleph Bet in the Hebrew alphabet, written except the letter Zion. And the reason is the victory of the kingdom of Israel stemming from Judah will not essentially emerge through weapons, Kalei Zion, even in modern Hebrew, like other nations. For the sword was the heritage of Esau. But the kings of Israel will not inherit the land by agency of their sword. With them, the natural law and the force of the hand are not operative. Rather, in accordance with merit and punishment, with the power on high of God, may he be blessed, Israel will be victorious. And if you'll permit me, I just want to just quickly read again my comment on this. Each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a meaningful name. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, they all have a name and they have a meaning. The letter Zion means weapon. Rabbeinu Bachya notices that the letter Zion alone among all the letters is absent in the blessing Jacob gives to Judah. All of the remaining 21 letters are to be found. Judah is ultimately the tribe that gives its name to the Jewish people. Thus, Rabbeinu Bachya concludes that the absence of this one letter is to be noticed and teaches something essential about the future destiny of this people. There was and would be conflict in Jewish history that would require bearing arms. But yet the blessing foresees a hoped-for era in which weaponry will be cast away. In fact, Israel cannot achieve its destiny by means of arms. Israel's essence is to be located in areas of the spirit and the practice of moral values, including compassion and kindness. Now here, this structure, first of all, to me it's absolutely stunning about Rabbeinu Bachya in the 14th century. I could never, in many lifetimes, read the Blessing of Judah and figure out there's one letter missing. But he could, and that's what makes a great commentator, I guess. And so here, in the first passage I read, there was a missing Vav. Now, this whole structure is built on a missing Zion. You're seeing a pattern emerge here. And the letter Zion means weapons, and so the whole tenor of the blessing is changed. Yes, it's triumphal, but it's triumphal in the sense it would be through the means, says Rabbeinu Bachya, of moral achievement, of softer values, not having anything to do with military conflict or the bearing of arms. Now, again, the original passage remains the same. I don't think there's any question about it, and the traditional commentaries certainly support that. But what happens here, and this is the beauty of a vital tradition, is you have someone as brilliant as Bachya come along and take those verses, and through his vision and his eyes and the values that he brings to the text, he raises up that passage. It has a whole different valence now. It's about something different. And again, I can't read that passage without thinking Rabbeinu Bachya says this. And this is the way the tradition moves into the future and moves away from if you will, this verse, from a difficult past. Is that clear? Okay.
Are you sending copies of this to some of the politicians who want to bomb Iran?
I'm tempted. Yes. Another example that I particularly love, actually, and some of you who are familiar with Jewish liturgy this will probably resonate. There are some verses that in the course of a liturgical year this is from the book of Exodus, in the Parsha Kitisa. Remember when God's essence is revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, among the words that are said are the famous 13 attributes of God. Hashem El Rachon, Zet Melez, El Rachon V'Chanon, Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy unto the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That passage, Hashem Rachum V'Chanun, is said many times in the liturgical year. It's actually especially prominent on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and holds up this idea that the essence of God is about forgiveness, about starting anew, the possibility of a new beginning, overcoming conflict, forgiving the past, being free and being kind and compassionate. The problem is, if you look at the verses themselves in the text, this is what the continuation of those words say. And that is God, will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children's children, unto the third and unto the fourth generation. That part is not repeated in the synagogue. It's not repeated. But the passage, the original passage, is not such a it has compassion, but then it has, a very strong element of actually unfair judgment of passing on the responsibility for transgression even to future generations who are guiltless. It's a very difficult passage in its completeness, and actually is dealt with many times later in the tradition. But what I want to show you is that when the rabbis and the liturgists who make the decisions about moving from a biblical text to a liturgical text, which is really what's going to nourish people on an ongoing basis around the year, and shape their concept about God, the verse is quoted selectively. It's even more than that. It's transformed. And here, for those of you that know the Hebrew, I just want to take a moment of excursus just to remind you of this. When the change comes from compassion to judgment, in Hebrew, it's v'nakeh lo yanakeh, which means God will certainly not cleanse of transgressions that have been committed. And then he goes on saying, but they will be visited on future generations. But when the verse goes into the Siddur and into the liturgy of the Jewish people, the word nakeh is there. The nakeh is the last verse, for those that know this. And lo yanakeh, the negative is not there at all, and it completely changes the meaning to its opposite. And it ends with benakeh, which is often translated, and he cleanses. But the verse says, benakeh lo yanakeh. It's a construction of emphasis that God certainly does not cleanse. What's happening here is, I don't want to get too caught up in the detail, but what's happened here, you can actually see the hands of tradition, anonymous people over time who took this and shaped this tradition. Not only shaped what came down into liturgy, but really reshaped our conception of God, as the Jewish conception of God, as it moved from generation to generation into the future. And now we're talking about simply the compassion of God. And the idea that God would punish the guiltless is actually completely overturned, not only here, but in later texts as well. So you can see, you can actually, there are some moments like this when you can actually see the cutting and pasting. There's a difficult verse. It's a difficult verse. It's simply cut in half and transformed. And the good part is taken out and used, and the other part is discarded, simply discarded. It's there in the Torah, because that can't be discarded, and we read it. But in terms of its use, its liturgical use, it's completely absent. Yes?
I'd like to ask you about the word sacred. What is the Hebrew word that corresponds to that?
Kadosh probably.
Now, does kadosh, if something is kadosh, I don't know if you can say it that way, but if something is kadosh, does it contain restraints with respect to what you can do with it? Doesn't the fact of something being sacred, if I think about, sacred things, really, in general, they are things you you don't want to disturb. You want to leave be. Does
Yes.
kadosh mean the same sort of thing?
It does. Generally speaking, it does. And kadosh, often the literal sense is something that's separate and untouchable, in some sense untouchable. And a text, I think this is true of New Testament, and I'm sure true of Quran, and other, basic texts, formative texts in religious traditions that I'm aware of, that once they reach their final form, they are kadoshim. They're sacred. And even mistakes that came in by scribal error become sacred mistakes. They can't be touched. They can't be changed. However, and the secret of survival and keeping the tradition alive and vital is through the device of interpretation and selectivity in this sense. And that's what, to me, I marvel at. The way, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and I think this is the way we deal often with these difficult texts. Thank you for the question. I want to jump to the story of Phineas or Pinchas. Remember, Pinchas was a son of Aaron. He was a priest, really in the priestly line of the high priest. And where we know him most egregiously is at one point in the conflict with the Midianites in the desert, in the book of Numbers, is when he sees a Jewish man and a Midianite woman engaging in a public act of promiscuity, and he responds to it by taking his spear and without any due process, through his own zealotry, he goes and he dispatches both of them. He drives a spear through the two of them and kills them both. The Torah praises him lavishly. He is given kuhnat olam, eternal priesthood, and v'hinanina obtainla briti shalom, and I give him, ironically, the covenant of peace, briti shalom. Pinchas, and there's even a portion of the Torah that's named for him. We read Parshat Pinchas. He becomes kind of a stereotype of zealot in service of God, in service of God's values, hoping for purity of worship, and so forth. And even God praises him. He says, "You have assuaged my anger by doing what you did. Your anger restrained a greater anger. It may have done even greater destruction." That's what the pshat of the simple meaning of the text says. But this is a difficult model to hold up for me, for my children, my grandchildren, in community. Is this the kind of model that we want to hold up, the Torah enshrines? Well, there's a detail here. We were missing one vav, we were missing one zayin. Well, how about a vav katia, another vav that is truncated? And let me, if I can, I'd like to read my commentary my commentary on this particular passage. Very rarely in the Torah text is a letter cut in half. In fact, generally, an impaired letter would be reason to render a Torah scroll improper for use in public readings until the letter would be repaired. Even one letter that's erased or broken, you have to get another scroll to read. Only when the textual tradition mandates such an exception is it allowed. In the narrative of Pinchas, his reward is the covenant of peace. The third letter of Shalom, the Vav, Shin, Lamed, Vav, Mem Sofit, is cut in half. It is a Vav Katia, a truncated Vav. traditional Torah commentators are mostly silent on this detail. Yet in light of the ambivalence found in rabbinical literature about the propriety of Pinchas or Phinehas's behavior, his fervor, it might be possible that their reservations find expression in this strange detail. There's no doubt that the Torah text affirms Pinchas. It was only in later reflections that questions were raised: should Pinchas serve as a model of behavior? Pinchas committed a violent act without any due process. His way was not the pathway of peace. Thus, his reward might also reflect his own actions. The promise of peace he receives is impaired. Perhaps the implication is that his peace will be elusive, a reflection of the way that he had chosen to live. Perhaps the Masoretes, those who fixed the text and left instructions to impair the letter Vav in the word shalom, were intent on leaving a sign revealing their distancing from Pinchas. In a small, unusual detail of the text, perhaps a very important message is encoded. Now, my friends, this is actually, this is probably in the book one of my most daring assertions, because I didn't find this specifically from other commentators. However, what empowered me to do it, to say this might possibly be true, is that when you look at rabbinic literature after the Torah, which it's never stopped until this day, Pinchas, in many circles, is really, there are many question marks about him. He's compared, incidentally, to Elijah the prophet, who was also, some of you remember, a very zealous prophet, and who acted really, and is called a Kana'i, basically a zealot, and using the same language as Pinchas, as the text uses about Pinchas. The rabbis, so there's a lot of questions about Pinchas you find embedded in later literature. And Elijah, the story of Elijah, one critical part is actually the prophetic section that's read alongside this Torah reading. Each week there's a Torah portion, and then there's a portion from the prophets. And the prophetic portion that's paired with this passage in the annual cycle is actually about Elijah. And in this passage, Elijah, who had just with his own hands killed 450 priests of Baal, demonstrating his fervor, with his own hands he did this, he is taken on a guided journey to Mount Sinai, the only time, incidentally, in the Bible where there's a return to Mount Sinai. Nowadays, people go to Mount Sinai all the time, but in those days, they didn't. Now, Pinchas is guided back there. Elijah is guided back there, and he's put in a cleft of the rock, and he sees some remarkable things before him. And let me just remind you what it was. This is in the first book of Kings. And God said, "Go forth and stand upon the mountain before God. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before God. But God was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Kol Damama Daka, a still small voice, which actually, remember, becomes a prominent verse on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur as part of the Unatan Torah prayer. Kol Damama Daka, a still small voice. Elijah is rejected. He doesn't listen to God. All these manifestations that he sees are violent manifestations. He's told symbolically that God is not in any of them. God is found in a kol damama daka, a thin, small voice, a beautiful, eternal vision of a compassionate God, if you will, can only be heard or communicated with in silence. And Elijah doesn't hear it. He doesn't hear it. It's the antithesis of the way he acted as a prophet. And then right afterwards, he's dismissed as a prophet. And this is a commentary. It's in tension with the Torah reading. And you can see the rabbis here, by juxtaposing these two portions, are making a commentary about Pinchas and really advising a different pathway. And that's and that's what empowered me to say, well, maybe that truncated vav in Shalom means that he didn't really get the blessing of peace. He didn't live a life of peace, and therefore he doesn't get the reward of peace for sure for himself. So, friends, I knew this would be the case. The time is getting short, and it's about 10 to 5. So what I want to do is give you a little time. I'd be most happy to respond to any comments or questions that you have. This is just a sampling of this immense process of moving the tradition forward. And I just in conclusion, I just want to say that what the tradition does in moving, in being a vital tradition, moving forward, and I'm convinced that this is true of Christianity and Islam too, but the one that I know best, and I can make more of a positive assertion for, is about Judaism. That the way movement forward occurs is often through the instrumentality of interpretation, which even has the power, once you come across it and once you absorb it, is to heal up ancient troubling texts and raise them up and even turn them into something that are inspiring.